we live in this very interesting moment. And it makes you wonder, what people will say about us 1,000 years down the road. How we were messed up, how we made terrible kinds of behavior because it just wasn't obvious to us. And so it is that we have that jumps out at us from the story of David and Bathsheba from 2 Samuel, that the role of how men and women interact has often been most unpleasant and inappropriate throughout all sorts of time and throughout all sorts of cultures. It's very curious that we seem to, at this moment in time, say so much of what has gone on in those previous days is behavior that's inappropriate. And so it is, when you're a pastor, you hear stories, not the least of which of sexual abuse, somewhat regularly. But there really is a flood at this moment in time for our culture. And it is a first time, really, when victims feel that they are encouraged, in a sense, to come forward and share their pain. And at the same time, we struggle about doing that and not wanting to have anyone falsely accused. How do we protect against that? And that is how we are maneuvering as a culture at this point in time. It's very difficult for us, but it is absolutely essential, and it's really good, and it's several thousand years behind times. One in 6 women will be raped. 1 in 3 women will have some sort of sexual violence done against them. How can any decent person not be infuriated by this and propelled into some sort of action? And if we say we are among those who follow Jesus, well, this should motivate us all the more. How can we in any way avert our attention from that which is so serious? So we have this really first time when victims have the sense that they can come forward and unilaterally say that they have no responsibility for this. And that's a new moment for us. And this is a part of an age-old concern, and even one not the least of which that shows up a lot in the Bible. There are really uncomfortable stories in the Bible, and we like to sometimes just sort of skip over those, and we focus on the ones that are happier and make us feel good. But there's a lot of sexual abuse in the Bible, especially in the Old Testament. And to recognize, if you're at all a veteran of my preaching, I always stop significantly short of ever saying that these humans of the Bible are heroes. Because oftentimes, those people that get lifted up, that somehow are known for posterity, are people that are very flawed and have significant issues of how they've made terrible mistakes. And so it isn't about that they were perfect people. It isn't about that they did perfect actions. It was more about they had the heart of God. And that's what we ultimately will see with David. That having the heart of God brings you back to God ultimately time and time again, no matter how oftentimes we meander off into other directions. So we've been moving through the early stories of the Bible. That's what we do each fall. We begin at the beginning of the Bible, and by May we'll get to the end of the Bible. And so we have looked at creation. We have looked at the key covenant that God makes with Abraham that says, I'm going to make a great nation of you. You're going to be basically countless in numbers. You're going to have the promised land, which today we know as is Israel. And yet there was absolutely nothing perfect about Abraham. At one point, Abraham is concerned about his life, that he might be killed because his wife is quote-unquote beautiful, Sarah. And so he passes his wife off as his sister, which to some degree uncomfortably is partly true. but to say that, no, she's not my wife, and so that another man could take her. God gets upset and things happen, and so it does not come to fruition, but nonetheless, he offers. Abraham's nephew is Lot. Lot lives in Sodom. Sodom has not gone down in history in a positive manner. And the understanding is that Lot is the only decent person left in Sodom. And God interacts with Abraham, and Abraham makes the case that whatever you do, God, save my nephew Lot. And God does. So in that context, it's interesting that Lot is really far from a perfect person from a human, worldly standpoint. Because, okay, hospitality is really important to the biblical people. We agree with that. That's vital to us here as well. And so some strangers come, and they are in human form, but they come to be understood as angels. They come to Lot's house, and the people of the town say they want to come. Let those men out of the house, and we want to abuse them. So Lot is right in saying, no, absolutely not. But it's more than unsettling that he says, take my daughters and abuse them instead. And that down the road, Lot and his daughters will leave Sodom before it is destroyed. And so they're out, and there are no other men around, and so the daughters decide that they want to get impregnated by Dad. And somehow or another, Dad gets so drunk that he doesn't recognize that he is participating in these activities with his daughters. When we encountered King David now, his son Amnon will rape his half-sister Tamar. All these kinds of very unsettling stories that lead us to say, why are they in the Bible? What are we supposed to discern from this? And we also understand that the Bible is a living word, that there is something new and fresh that comes to us as our cultures change, as we move through various ways of understanding life. And in this moment in time, as we are looking at the role of men and women in a new, fresh sense, these stories of the Bible hit us squarely between the eyes and give us a lot of information as to ways to find a way forward. So now we move to the journey to the story of David and Bathsheba. So the people are in the promised land. Last week we saw Joshua who brought them into the land. And so now the covenant with Abraham really has come to fruition. There are a great number of people. They have the land of Israel. And God has made it so abundantly clear. The very first commandment, and I would say the foundation of the commandments, is God saying, I'm the Lord your God, don't have any other ones, okay? If you do that, we'll be good. But yet the people always want to take one step, and the unsettling piece in that is that God seems to allow us to make poor decisions. And so it was as the people said, well, you know, God, you're great. You are our capital K king, of course. But it'd be really nice to have some earthly leaders from time to time, kind of as an intercessor for you, all right? What do you say, God? And God says, well, that's not what I want. You know I want to be the only authoritative voice in your life. But fine. So we encounter the time of the judges. Judges were not like we use the term today. The judges were leaders that were brought up for a certain specific concern, usually a military one. And so we went through that time. And the people come back to God and they go, hey, you know, those judges were awesome. Thanks, God. Really appreciate you doing that. But you know what? Those judges, they kind of come and go. But we have issues every single day of our lives. Don't get mad, Big G, but it'd be great to have kings. A little K king, all right? What do you say? Into that moment comes the person named Samuel. Samuel, by my eyes, is one of the very few people in the Bible that doesn't have all sorts of ways in which he was tainted. One of the few people that seems to be, even from a human perspective, he was pretty good. And so Samuel is the one that God calls to ordain a king. Now understand, or anoint a king, that anoint is an English word. If you translate that into Hebrew, the word is Messiah. If you translate anoint into Greek, it's Christ. So this was no small thing. It was to make a Messiah out of a human. Now, it might be a little M Messiah if you like, but nonetheless, that is what Samuel is instructed by God to do for a human being. And Samuel, in as genteel a way as possible, says, "Really, God? You want to do this?" And God says, "That's what the people want. So let them have it, and they will experience the consequences." Samuel says, "Well, okay." So the first king that's anointed by Samuel is Saul. We're talking a little over 3,000 years ago. I feel bad for Saul, I do. Saul had a mental health concern. He had low self-esteem. And so he's king of a fairly powerful nation. But there's this upstart kid named David. Ooh, everybody loves David because David takes this slingshot with a little stone in it and slings it and kills the big dude Goliath, who just goes, boop. And now everybody says, "Oh, we just love David. He's so awesome, you know." Saul goes, "Great. People love David. I'm king, but they're not really impressed with me. Things don't go so well in military stuff." Saul ultimately commits suicide in disgrace. David becomes king. Samuel anoints him. All right. Everything seems to be absolutely perfect. David is the golden boy. He's very talented. He's good looking. He's not only musical, but he writes profound words. And he's a good leader. He's a very intense warrior. Perfect for a leader 3,000 years ago. Israel will never match the power that they have, the influence, as that point in time. Still today, really, any kind of Jewish person would look to David and go, "That's a key moment in our history. That's really what we yearn for," that type of worldly influence. Well, in our colloquial ways of language, we have this phrase that we do that says, "Absolute power corrupts absolutely," right? And any of us is vulnerable. That's the disquieting piece of this, that it seems you give us power and humans don't handle it well. It's like, for all of you people that are trying to win the lottery, remember that it seems a huge, significant part of those people that win the lottery end up being broke ultimately. And you go, how does that happen? Well, it's like with power. It is power. Somehow we can't handle it. And it was true even for David. So he's out on his roof one day, sees Bathsheba, and summons her. She gets pregnant. He has Bathsheba's husband killed out in the battlefield. David takes Bathsheba as his wife. Now here's the dicey moment that you need to each individually, internally deal with. Is Bathsheba in any way responsible? Does she bear even a modicum of responsibility for this encounter? Throughout history, a lot of people really have put this on Bathsheba, that she was the seductress, out there bathing and hoping that David would come out on his balcony and notice. After all, David's a man. Men can't be responsible. So It was all Bathsheba. Rembrandt has a painting that is disquieting of Bathsheba. That's really how people have set it up. And for me, in the context of what we are looking at for the first time, where, the term sexual harassment is new to us. Only a couple decades ago, somehow men imposing behavior onto women was deemed to be acceptable. If a woman had the audacity to strike back just a little bit, it goes, what's the matter? This is just banter. We're just having fun. Lighten up. You women should appreciate the attention. When you read the story of Bathsheba, it really is interesting. As much as we think that, even kind of the mores of our day are negative or something, the Bible oftentimes speaks much more plainly than our 21st century American ears can handle. And we try to move around that, and we don't even always translate things quite accurately into English to smooth them over a bit. And anyone who is a veteran of my preaching knows that I say when you read the Bible, stop when you find something that seems strange and say, why is that there? Why did the writer in that book choose to put in what he did? Well, that happens in the story of David and Bathsheba. Because this is really indelicate, but it's there. And I think this answers the question about, was Bathsheba a terrible seductress? Because it says that Bathsheba was doing her monthly ritual bathing. That for those women that were of childbearing years, every time after that time of the month, you had to take a ritual bath. Because they were big into clean and unclean, all sorts of ways in their understanding of society at that point, and this was one of them. And so, why tell us this? Isn't that just too much information? Do we really need to know about her cycle? Yes, we do. And I find this fascinating, given the context of when all this was written, so very long ago, when it was such a patriarchal society, that we read this now with 2018 American eyes and ears. Listen with our ears. That she was just doing what was normal. She was doing what she had to do every month in her ritual bathing. This was normal activity. That she wasn't out there displaying herself. That for me, in this particular moment in time of my reading, it absolves Bathsheba of all responsibility. David had all the power, and David had all the responsibility. And he doesn't understand that he abused that power. And we understand that for each of us, that whenever things get clouded over and we deny. So his buddy Nathan, who is his keen advisor, can't handle it. You took this guy's wife and you had him killed. How do you deal with that? You are supposed to be this godly guy. So, these were kind of basic times. Nathan is really taking his life into his own hands if David just decides, I don't like what you said, boom. But Nathan decides he's going to take the risk. And he has to come slyly to David. So he makes up this story. Well, there's a rich guy and a poor guy, and the rich guy takes the poor guy's lamb and eats it and whatever. And so David goes, well, that's terrible. That guy should just die. Well, or at least give 4 times back in lambs. And Nathan says, you're that man. And David in that instant is convicted. He goes, oh man. And he writes Psalm 51. Create in me a clean heart, O God. Renew a right spirit within me. Restore to me the joy of your salvation. Cooler, more important words have never been spoken. It understands that God forgives everything, even when we are insanely stupid. And so for you, what are those moments in time where you encounter in your daily life abuse of power? It might be in matters of sexuality, but there are all sorts of ways in which power can abuse. And that simply is unacceptable. That abusive power must be confronted. Such actions against the vulnerable cannot be tolerated. Understanding that when we confront it, there will be resistance. And any person can do that, but I submit to you that the unique part about being one who follows Jesus is we have the best answer for any sort of resolution or, if you will, redemption. It is the story of David. A terrible story. A story that should make us uneasy. A story that we should go, I really don't want to hear this. And so it is that we each in our own lives have such stories. Where sometimes we're the ones who fail, sometimes we're the ones who are the victim, but in all of it, it can consume us. And God offers the one way forward. And so it is, how is God calling you into wherever you see the abuse of power? To confront it, to risk the resistance that you'll meet, only because you know that as one who follows Jesus, you bring the best opportunity for reconciliation, for resolution, for redemption. Amen.